Hello, Endeavor here. So tonight I'm here with a very special guest. He has one of the best YouTube channels on the internet, in my opinion. I'm here with Devon Stack from the channel Black Pilled. How are you doing tonight, Devon?
Doing good, doing good. Thanks for having me on.
And the reason I wanted to have you on and what I wanted to discuss tonight is that my channel, I focus it on neo-reactionary thought and on criticizing liberalism and liberal democracy and the notion that we live in this free and open society that we are really told the West is today. And what I wanted to talk about was how propaganda is used to facilitate kind of that lie, because what, for me at least, when I was kind of looking into all this stuff and becoming red pilled, one of my favorite authors was Mencius Moldbug, and he called what he called the Cathedral was essentially the organs of power asserting itself over the Western world, and he claimed that was what was pushing progressive or leftist politics. Some people might call it the deep state, some people might call it the globalists, or some people might refer to it as a name that would get us banned from YouTube, but we're not going to go there. So there was two major channels for me that really were the ones that just exposed it for me, and it just showed it clear as day. And one of them was the unfortunately defunct Frame Game Radio, and he really showed the legal aspects and the laws in place that facilitate, I guess you could say cultural Marxism or progressivism or leftist politics. And the other one was your channel, exposing the propaganda involved with promoting the, I guess you could say, cultural Marxist, anti-white agenda. So for anyone who doesn't know, what's the focus of the channel, Devon?
It started out, to be honest, like it just started out as kind of like, it was a little boomer tier, to be honest, because it was more like, the deep state, trying to stop Donald Trump and all this stuff. And then I just kind of slowly got black-pilled because I just saw that, like, wow, there's really no, there's no solution using this existing system. We got Trump elected. He didn't really follow through on any of his promises. And I saw this really early on because there were some real easy things he could have done right off the bat that I assumed he was going to do right off the bat that just weren't getting done. And my background is in filmmaking and in propaganda. I've worked for big political nonprofits pushing their agendas and stuff like that in the past. And I've worked for, actually the federal government doing, some of the same sort of stuff. And so having done this for years, and anyone that's worked in film or even aspiring, I think, filmmakers, when you start analyzing movies, it's almost like it's impossible to enjoy them anymore because you just sit there and you're like, oh, I like this shot, or oh, I understand why they, did this, introduced the character this way, or whatever. You're just sitting there trying to dissect everything about it. And the more I started doing that at a young age, even because I wanted to, make movies my whole life, that was kind of my whole thing. You start to realize like there's a lot of like leftist messaging in basically everything. And I didn't understand why at first, but it was, you could tell in almost anything, like the most innocuous, even commercials, things that they're trying to sell, it's like the Stone Toss comic, burgers, it's gotten extra bad now. So I did a video at one point. I forget what it was. It might have been the Falling Down video, but I did a video, I think specifically on Falling Down because so many people were saying how based it was. And I was like, I haven't seen that movie in a really long time, certainly since not since I've been red pilled on a lot of things. So I watched it again and I was just horrified by the movie. Cause I remember thinking like, this movie's based, like a lot of people used to say, like, yeah, it's like this white guy that gets really pissed off at the world and kind of goes off the rails. And then you look and see who the director was. And I forget his name offhand, but it was this wealthy Jewish gentleman from Manhattan who happens to be gay. And it's like, oh, so not exactly the kind of, a person that would be pushing our message, that sort of thing. And you look at the actor, what's his name? He's Hollywood royalty. His father's actually really famous too, but he's Jewish too. And you start to realize that, like, oh, so I analyze the movie, and you can watch my video if you want to see the deep dive on it, but you realize that this is kind of a farewell to white people, a good riddance to this kind of a angry white person, and it's the changing of the guard, so to say, or so to speak. Like, there's a part of the film where the old white detective is retiring, and he's being replaced by a young Hispanic female, and like the main character, after he dies, literally like an hour later, his wife is having a birthday party for their daughter like he never existed in the first place, and he's that unnecessary, so it just I realized, like, wow, this is like the opposite of Based. And you start looking at a lot of these other movies, giving them a second look, and so that's kind of how it that's why I started doing that more and more on my channel, because I've kind of been so black-pilled on the Trump administration for years now at this point, and every time, like, you think maybe he's going to do something, he disappoints you again. So I was like, all right, well, let's just start doing, and this is my, they always say, like, write what you know, and so this is what I know. And so I focused on just dissecting propaganda, and like I said, it's scary to see how saturated our culture is. And my last video, for example, I had to be on BitChute, so I won't go into too much detail about it, but it's just about who wrote like the majority of our Christmas songs. And so when you realize how little control the white Christian majority has had over its own culture, it's kind of shocking. So that's pretty much what I think I need to see.
The two videos, I think the two first ones I saw of yours were Norma Ray and Pleasantville was the other big one. And I would have been able to say, like, well, that's propaganda. It's, it's feminism, or it's, they'll have the token minority or something like that. But then, like, with these ones, it was, I couldn't believe it, because it was just showing in your face something that is multi-generational, kind of like the destruction of, white Anglo-Saxon America, really. Just the amount of, the amount of finesse that it was done with. And not only that, but in the case of Norma Ray, just the amount of arrogance of the people that the people that are making that movie. Like, I mean, I'm a nationalist, but I couldn't make a movie like Norma Ray without just feeling like, I just couldn't make a movie like that without just feeling like a complete prick, to be honest. But I mean, you can really see in this propaganda how multi-generational the kind of cultural influence is, especially with one like Pleasantville. I guess if anyone hasn't seen that review, what was Pleasantville really about, and what messages were they trying to push there?
Right. So with Pleasantville, and I remember watching that when it was new, and I really liked the aesthetic of it. I was like, oh, this is really cool. They got like the black and white world of, Leave It to Beaver aesthetic going on, and like they show how a 90s kid is like out of place. But then even in the 90s, or whenever this was, I think it was like 99 when this came out, I remember watching it, and the ending was just kind of, they laid it on really extra thick, that like, oh, well, the bad people are actually the white males that are just racist, because they turn it into like this metaphor where in the movie, if you haven't seen it before, this kid from the 90s and his sister get sucked into like a Leave It to Beaver episode, essentially, and it's in black and white, and it's the whole like, oh, fish out of water story. But what happens is they start subverting this Leave It to Beaver world with their 90s culture. And as like the teenage girls in this 1950s fantasy world, start having sex, for example, they turn into color. And so then, like, the town is split between a group of people in color and a black and white half. And of course, the black and white evil white male side is oppressing the quote unquote colored people. And so it just becomes like this whole, intricate metaphor for the subversion of the 1950s Americana that a lot of people today look back and think like, how did we lose this? How can we go back to this? This is what I want. But in the 90s, it was like they were celebrating its demise. And while at the same time, in a kind of cruel way, cashing in on the nostalgia. They knew that people wanted that. That was the whole draw to that aesthetic. Like when I watched it, that I was drawn to that aesthetic because the 90s was not that great. And it's been getting worse ever since. And so you see that, but then they try to like make you see or make you think that, oh no, look how oppressive it was though, because you couldn't have pointless premarital sex in the back of a car back then without being slut shamed. You couldn't leave your husband, like the Leave It to Beaver mom just leaves her husband because she just decides to. Like, there's no real reason. The guy's, nothing's wrong with him. He's a Leave It to Beaver dad. He's like a good dad. He's a good provider. She doesn't have to work, but she kind of likes this other guy more because he's a little more interesting. So she just leaves him, and it's really bizarre to watch this celebration of the destruction of that culture. And then they also throw in a element of Eve in the Garden of Eden. Like it's not, they lay it on pretty thick. It's not like reading too much into symbolism like a lot of these people that analyze movies are like, oh, you see that painting on the wall behind that lady, that's clearly, that shows that, like, the satanic nature. It's like, no, there's literally a garden that they go to, and she plucks an apple from a tree and runs to the boy who's still black and white, and to tempt him with the apple. And so it's literally satanic. Like, the movie is saying, yeah, you had this paradise, and we came here and turned it all upside down, and you just need to deal with it, and it's progress. And it's really kind of frightening when you think about, in the same, the usual suspects, of course, were behind the writing and producing and directing of the film. And once you know about cultures that aren't the same as, or cultures that I guess are steering the Hollywood culture, you realize that the big element of that is upending the host culture. So it is something they would want to celebrate. It's just really, it's really a frightening film when you see this. And like I said, back then I didn't notice it at all. And that's something else I kind of want to talk about too, is when you have the distance of especially like a few decades or something like that, a lot of this stuff's really easy to see. But when you're in it, like when baby boomers watched Norma Ray, for example, it's not as easy to see because you're kind of seeped in that culture. That's part of, even as manufactured as it might be, it's part of your culture. And so you don't have that perspective, that outsider's look. So, when you have like a good decade or so, or in this case, I think, that movie's like 20 years old. I mean, it's really easy to spot.
Yeah. And, one thing I noticed is, first of all, there's kind of the on the surface, they're kind of saying like, we liberated us from the oppressive 1950s. But like you pointed out, there's kind of that subliminal, like, wink that, they're kind of acknowledging that they're actually destroying you. And secondly, I also find it fascinating how the propaganda, it always pushes in the same direction, but it takes different forms in different decades. Like, what I thought was so fascinating, you had pointed out, was that how they had that scene with the girl who I can't remember her name. It was that she was disappointed with the 1950s guy because, he wouldn't have sex with her on like the first date, and he was like being a gentleman. Whereas today they tell us that, before the feminism movement of the 1960s, men could just like, get away with rape and sexual assault, and that, they were just out of control before then, and there was absolutely nothing women can do. And like, or you think of something like American Pie, for example, and I looked at the author who wrote American Pie, and same crowd, but it seems like it's always progressing. So they always like have a new stage to go to, and oftentimes it's denouncing the previous stage. And of course, they always write that off as being the fault of white Anglo-Saxon America, when really it's just the same people who wrote the previous decade's propaganda writing this decade's propaganda. Have you noticed that a lot, that they kind of just change the messaging and in many ways to denounce the previous messaging.
Well, you got to understand, they play the long game. Like, think for example, Obama, when he ran for president in 2008, was against gay marriage. And you know that he really wasn't, but publicly he knew what he could get away with. And I feel like that's kind of the same thing, that they know where they want to end up, and they're willing to say whatever they need, whatever they think that the audience is ready to hear now, they'll say it. Another good example. So one project I've been working on for a long time, and the only reason it's not done is I have computer problems. But the television series Cheers, it ran for like 11 seasons. So you have 11 years that you can look at the first season, like what were they pushing, in this decade, and what were they pushing by the end of it. And it's like all the characters have been totally reinvented, and because they have shifted with the Overton window, essentially. Another good series to look at is The Simpsons. You can look at, like, Simpsons have been going on for like 30 years or something like that. And you can look at, season 1 or season 2, and it's actually, by today's standards, it's a conservative cartoon. And at the time it was very edgy and progressive. So they're always pushing the Overton window just as hard as they think they can get away with. And every once in a while there is kind of like a watershed moment, something like where they can get away with a whole lot all at once, and nothing's there to stop them, because, as we know, conservatives haven't conserved anything, especially not culture. So you see this. We go from gay marriage to trans kids in a relatively short period of time, but there's other things that take a long time to push. The gay marriage thing is a perfect example. They were pushing I think the first season of Cheers was in like 1982 or something like that, and the first season they were already pushing the gay agenda, and that would have been like super taboo in 1982. So they had to lightly tiptoe around it, and it was just more of, at that point, it was more just about acceptance. So in the episode I'm thinking about, the bar realizes that there's a few gay people that are showing up at the bar, and they're afraid that we don't want to turn into the gay bar, so we need to find out who's the gay people and root them out and make sure they don't come here, because we don't want to be known as the gay bar. And then by the end of it, of course, they're all hanging out with the gay guys, and they think the gay guys are actually not so bad after all. And while you might think, oh, well, what's wrong with that? That's not such a bad message. That's the thing is, they just escalate and escalate and escalate.
It's the tip of the spear. It's the tip of the spear.
Right. And so that's how they get in, and they just keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it until eventually we get to, right now, at least currently, it's trans kids now, but in 10 years it's going to be worse, because there's nothing stopping that either. So it's, in 10 years, I think that's going to be, honestly, the normalization of pedophilia or something like that. And you'll be able to go back in time and be like, oh, I can't believe that 20 years ago they thought screwing kids was bad, and now and now it's on TV. So it's they play the long game, and there's really no opposition to it, is the other thing. Like, because I was talking to my mom the other night, because I've been trying to slowly red/black pill her a little bit, because she's a boomer, and it's been an uphill battle, but I'm getting a little progress. And I was telling her, it's weird to me that in a Christian society, as you could say America at least was, and it's still, I think, 65% self-identify as Christian, that if you have like a Christian rock station, that it's called a Christian rock station. Like, shouldn't it just be a rock station in a Christian country? Like, why is it so weird that you would, like, if I went to an Islamic country, I wouldn't expect them to be like, oh, differentiate between the two. I wouldn't think they'd be like, oh, this is the Islamic music channel. It would just be, here's the music channel, and we're Islamic, And I kind of feel like that kind of illustrates how little control Christian Europeans have had over their own culture, is that when they do sort of make something, it's like seen as this separate niche kind of a thing. Like, if you were to swap out, just as an example, if you were to swap out all the studio heads at every studio in Hollywood and every television executive and record label executive just magically, wave a magic wand, that all you changed was that all these people suddenly became white Christian males. And you didn't tell them, you didn't give them any directives, you didn't tell them what to do or anything like that. You just magically changed that. I mean, it would be the difference overnight would be so stark. Like the culture would change overnight, and not because of any plan or because of any collusion necessarily between these people. It's just that they would make different decisions because they're different people with different cultural backgrounds and different levels of acceptability in terms of behavior and morals and that sort of a thing. So that would be reflected in the projects that they greenlit, and that would be reflected in the way they covered news and everything else. And so when you have a small minority that doesn't reflect the values of the majority in control of all of the culture, essentially, certainly in mass media for almost 100 years, no one should be surprised that the culture has been as mutated as it is, because it's not just mutated, it's manufactured, and then it's slowly leading the public to an end that I think that we're rapidly approaching. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I got 2 super chats. The Simpsons has had a blatantly pro-illegal immigration episode, and American Dad also had a pro-illegal immigration episode too. One thing that I was also wondering about is, because I used to be a big fan of I was never, into all this like SJW shit, but I was a big fan of a lot of the really like raunchy humor when I was, maybe 18. So people like Howard Stern, Jack Black. And, I don't think that they'd be able to really get away with a lot of this stuff. Well, I mean, Howard Stern is still on the air, but I think that I'm just surprised that they're still able to get away with it. And now, when I look, now that I actually know, who Howard Stern and Jack Black are, it kind of makes a bit more sense. But what would you say about that kind of, I guess, would it be 2000s kind of era, the kind of like raunchy, making jokes about, people about genitalia, and being like nihilistic. What do you think happened to that? Because I don't really see much of that anymore.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. I think it was a necessary step. In as much, I'll admit, I enjoyed. I liked American Pie. I liked Superbad. I liked all those movies.
Oh, I did too. Yeah.
At the time, I thought they were hilarious. But when looking back now at what effect did that have on the culture, it was normalizing degeneracy. It was normalizing just taking away the I'm trying to think the right word here, the making us into basically just animals.
Standards.
I'm sorry? Oh yeah, the standard. Yeah, but like taking away the grace of human beings, or the whatever separates us from animals. I don't, there's a word I'm trying to think of that I can't come up with right at the moment, but essentially just debasing humans. And it was funny. These guys are talented. That's the thing that people need to understand. A lot of times when I go hard at some of these movies and stuff, they think what I'm saying is that it's poorly made. And it's like, no, it's really well made. That's the problem. Like it's really, it's like heroin probably feels amazing. It's not that heroin is not enjoyable. It's that it is enjoyable, and that's the problem. And it's the same thing with these movies. It's not the problem that they're not artfully done, or that they're not enjoyable. It's just that they are. And what you don't realize is the messaging that's being pumped, or some people I don't think realize the messaging that's being pumped into their heads as they're watching them, and it's deliberate. So in terms of how that, I think it was a necessary step. And I think that while there's probably some specific comedians and filmmakers that look back to that era and think, oh, I can't believe that was the peak of free speech, or it was in between. It was like we went from having blasphemy laws, where people like Lenny Bruce were getting arrested for talking about degenerate things on stage, to now it's like the new blasphemy laws are if you say anything bad about gay people. But in the 2000s, it was like the in between. It was the changing of the guard, basically changing of who controlled what the blasphemy laws were, and so we went from you can't say anything bad about Jesus or any you can't disrespect the morality or the sensitivities of the white Christian majority, to now you can't say anything that is going to offend the sensibilities of a quadriplegic trans black lesbian, whatever. It's just flipped. It's just gone to the other extreme. And that was, I think, the middle point. It was just the midpoint where you could piss off anyone, but it couldn't last for very long, because it was just the pendulum swaying to the other side.
Yeah, I got a comment from Iconoclast. He makes a good point that Sacha Baron Cohen, he had like his career on edgy humor. He had Borat and Bruno, and just like the kind of that really like raunchy humor that I was referring to with people like Black Jack. And now he's basically just all on board with the progressive agenda, and he's doing talks at the ADL for God's sakes. But
right. Well,
one thing I
Well, I was just going to say, like, that his job was to destroy the old blasphemy laws so that they could establish the new blasphemy laws. So that's essentially all he was there to do, was to I'm going to push the envelope, and I'm going to violate all of the rules that the white Christian majority established, either explicitly or implicitly. And I'm going to make it to where I'm going to normalize, the crudest kind of humor, so that when we reestablish the blasphemy laws, it's there's nothing in opposition to us. So I think he was 100%. Whether it was some part of some plan or just that's just how people operate, I don't know, but he 100% had a hand in destroying the old blasphemy laws which had to be done in order to establish the new ones.
Yeah, and what Morgoth had pointed out, and Iconoclast also wrote the same thing in the chat. It's that basically his shtick was that with Borat, he plays the raging anti-Semite, and you might think, well, it's maybe based humor, but then what it really is doing is it's making anyone that could possibly think along those lines. It makes that person out to be ridiculous, so that no one could ever think that. Could ever question that, because
it's like Archie Bunker.
They've implanted in your mind that
Archie Bunker is in fact I'll let you just imagine who the writers were of that show, and he was it was the same sort of thing. The average American is like, oh, I can't believe he said that, but really what they don't understand is it's being demonized. It's like or the Colbert Show, where he would play this hyperbolic version of a conservative, and he'd say all these things, but it was satire, and it was meant to dehumanize people that actually held beliefs similar to that. And so yeah, absolutely, when he was playing these parts, or when he was interviewing so-called conservatives and trying to humiliate them on camera and that sort of thing, that was all part of what you have to do. You have to deconstruct the blasphemy laws, deconstruct the people trying to conserve those laws, so that you can have power. And that's a lot of how that's done is through ridicule. It's the same thing. That's why they get so angry at the memes, the people on the right that make memes, because ridicule is so effective, and the left is just really easy to ridicule. So and they've lost their sense of humor about it. And much in the same way, you could say that the right didn't really maybe have much of a sense of humor about themselves in, say, the 1950s. So, I guess that's another pendulum that has swung.
Yeah, you mentioned what would be called blasphemy law, because I find one of the assessments that I had is that either progressivism or liberalism, whatever you want to call it, leftist politics, it has kind of taken on a religious, it's kind of replaced Christianity as an egalitarian secular religion for the masses. And I find that a lot of it uses a lot of the same symbology and a lot of the same kind of means of control that a religion would. And I don't necessarily think that religions are bad. My gripe against it is that it's a religion designed to destroy us. For example, when you point out, like, we had the NPC meme that some will have like this visceral reaction to being shown something to that is almost like it's pre-planned. Like, I get the sense with a lot of progressive pundits and a lot of the media figures, like take the Covington Catholic kids, for example. It essentially struck every single nerve that burning a Quran would in front of a Muslim, or blaspheming in front of a nun 200 years ago would have. And that's why I think the reaction was so over the top and just so vicious and immediate from someone like Kathy Griffin or Reza Aslan against the Covington Catholic kids, because it really went against the symbology of the religion, and which is, I've also come to the conclusion that the most fundamental tenet of the religion is that it's anti-white. It's and the most revered figure in this new religion is Hitler, and that Hitler is essentially the embodiment of evil in the same sense that Jesus would have been the embodiment of good in Christianity, and that they've tied basically anything that could be considered pro-white, anything that could be considered pro-European, anyone advocating for their own interests, they've tied that with Nazism, which they've tied with racism, which they've tied to basically any kind of right-wing politics in a direction that you and I would want to go in. Not that, just for the YouTube censors, we're not saying we want it to go in the direction of Hitler, but you get the idea, though. The point I'm trying to make is that they've kind of like turned it into a religion that it gives people this visceral reaction to anything that can be considered pro-white. And would you say that there is it kind of has taken on a more religious mentality amongst the people that believe in it?
Well, right, and that's something I was pushing on Twitter just the other day. There's a lot of people that need to understand that. First of all, you got to think to yourself, what do you think their end game is? And we don't have to say it out loud, but I think we know what their end game is. And in order to accomplish that end game, one of the major steps is you have to dehumanize the enemy. And I noticed a long time ago, I would say even 15, 20 years ago, when I first started paying attention to this stuff, the one thing I noticed about the left, even then, was we think they're wrong and they think we're evil. Like, I would look at a leftist and I would think, wow, you're just really misguided. You don't get it. You don't understand what you're saying, because you don't have an understanding of the facts. Your worldview is kind of messed up for whatever reason. And they would look at me and think, you're just evil. You're evil. You're a bigot. You're bad. You're a bad person. It wasn't, they couldn't put themselves in my shoes. And I think because their end game is different, at least the people pulling the strings, the end game is different. And part of that end game means you need to dehumanize the enemy. And so what better way? And another thing I think about in order to accomplish this end game is, a lot of times, just historically speaking, or not even that historically, just look at what Islam, how that operates. But religion plays a huge role when you want to motivate people, because you're creating something. It's like, think of how many suicide bombers would there be if no one believed in Allah? Zero. So if you want to motivate people to do extreme things to accomplish your extreme goals, you need to at least have some element of the supernatural in there, because they need to feel that there's something bigger than themselves, bigger than reality, bigger than everything that they're a part of, in order to want to participate in some of these things. And humans have evolved to be religious anyway. You've got I forget who it was that said that if you take away or if you stop believing in God, you don't believe in nothing, you'll believe anything. And there is some truth to that, because you're programmed to believe in some kind of religious system. And so if that religious system is erased off your hard drive, It's like you want to install something there, and I think that's what's happened to a lot of leftists. Is we're programmed to operate with that that mechanism in place, and so when it's removed, you got to stick something there. And for them, it's been the global warming stuff, or the white people are evil, and Black Lives Matter, all this stuff. And so it has become a religion to them. The thing that's weird to me, the thing that I don't quite understand, to be honest, is I expect this kind of thing to work on people that that are immigrant. Like, let's just, in the context of America, I would expect that to work on people that aren't from America, that aren't part of the European founding stock, that sort of a thing. Because in a way, you could say that it is in their interest to oppose the founding stock, because they don't want to be minorities any more than we do. And but what I find fascinating is when you have so many, and I think women, it's the numbers are maybe even a little higher, but you have so many people who are acting against their own interests, their own tribal interests, where they are they're basically, it's really hard, I guess, for people like us to sometimes get people to care about their own tribe. I guess I'm trying to like say this in a very YouTube friendly way, but it's really hard to get. It sometimes feels very futile, like even with my my boomer parents, when I've talked to them, like trying to convince them that look, you need to have some loyalty to your group. You have to have some in-group preference here, and the stunning lack of in-group preference is something that has puzzled me more than anything. To see them adopt this religion and throw away the religion of their ancestors so quickly has been the one thing I have a hard time understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of my assessments of it is that a lot of because despite how we are so well, not us, but society is so egalitarian today, and that's the real messaging that's being pushed. I definitely think that hierarchies work, that the middle class is kind of the choke point, that the elites are in control, but they kind of need to control that 20, 30, well, maybe not 30%, maybe 10, 15, 20% of middle class. So the lawyers, the doctors, the educated ones, the ones that go to universities, the ones that are essentially facilitating the system that's been put in place. And I think that just historically, there's really been a pressure on the middle class to appear to conform to the morality of the time. And I think this would have been the case, say, in the Victorian era. So, a middle class man in Victorian England, I'd imagine, him being a respectable Christian gentleman, who's loyal to the Queen, would have been very important for him, for both for status, but also kind of just for fitting in and kind of advancing his own status and getting cut to that higher level. And I find that with a lot of the middle class liberals, the people who really political correctness is directed at them, because you can be a construction worker and you can be as right wing, nationalistic, or racist, whatever you want to say, whatever you want to call it, as you want. They don't care because you have no power. But with the middle class, they really need to control them, and they've done this really good job, I find, at making caring about your nation, your ethnic group, about morality or something. They've done a really good job at making that feel that seem backward or out of date. So I guess like what I remember, I'm from Canada, and I remember that in the 2000s, in the Bush era, there was this kind of like real like snobbery amongst Canadians that we're not like those racist, bigoted Americans voting for Bush, and that kind of came back in 2015, 2016 with Trump. And I find that that's who the religion is really aimed at, because the elites are the ones that are facilitating, that are pushing it for their own interests. The working class are the ones getting screwed, but they don't have the power and they don't have the influence. It's the middle class, and they really put a lot of the social pressure. And I also think a lot of it is just fear, because for me personally, kind of when I was becoming red pilled and I started to understand the issues of mass immigration, Islam. I know that one's kind of outdated now, but and various things like that. I found, if I was watching what could be considered far right content, or the stuff I'm making now, if I'd seen my own work, in 2014, 2015, I kind of felt almost like I was a teenage boy in the 1950s looking at a Playboy. Like it wasn't like I really had any good arguments against it. It's just, it felt dirty because you had been just, bombarded by the propaganda so long and taught that if you think in this way, you are evil. Right. And that, I think, for a lot of people is the fence that they need to get over. Would you say you notice that, especially amongst the middle class?
Right. And I think the way it works with the middle class is because, I was basically upper middle class. So I lived in several big cities. I lived in Washington, D.C. for a while. I lived in San Francisco. And the way that I see this work is that when you're in a situation like that, especially when it's multicultural and no one's even really from these cities, almost everyone's from somewhere else, and they've just come to go work at the multinational business or, the government agency or whatever it is that drew them there. But they show up and they work all day long. They maybe go to happy hour or something like that. But then they go home to their little cubby hole in the giant apartment building, or wherever it is they go. They don't know their neighbors. They don't have any kind of local community interaction. All of their interaction is with the propaganda. So that replaces, like so when I first moved to DC, I moved to DC from the Southwest, where I would wear flip-flops to work and it wasn't a big deal. And I rode the metro to go fill out some paperwork when I first moved to DC to work doing this gig, doing video work for a government agency. And I was dressed like I would go to an agency in the Southwest, wearing flip-flops and shorts and T-shirt. And I felt more underdressed than I ever had in my entire life because everyone else in the metro is wearing three-piece wool suits and that sort of a thing. And I was like, wow. But because I had that social feedback, I knew by Monday I better be wearing a suit when I showed up to work. And I was. And so the social feedback that people are getting now is artificial. It's the social feedback they're getting now is when they watch TV and 25% of the characters in these fake scenarios are gay. And they think, oh, then, it's like they've done, I think Gallup did the poll where millennials vastly overestimate the real numbers of gay people in America, where I think the real numbers are something like really small, something like 2 or 3%. And they're being estimated at like 30% by these millennials that participate in these polls. And the reason it is because when you flip on the TV, and that has become your social feedback for like what is around you. Even though it's totally fake, where else you can interact? I lived in apartment buildings for years with not only not ever having met the neighbors who lived like just on the other side of a wall, but actively avoiding meeting the neighbors that lived just on the other side of a wall. And, for years I would do that. I lived in several buildings where I didn't want to know who these people were, and so you have no real social feedback. All of your social feedback is coming from this TV screen or, from Hulu or whatever. And so I think that's kind of how they've gotten this middle class to behave in this way and in this kind of suicidal way, because they think that they're conforming to what society is, when really what they're conforming to is the fantasy society that's being shown to them on their screens.
Yeah, because I even remember when I was a young boy and I would watch, different like action films and stuff. I one thing that really stuck in my mind was how there always was this, powerful 5'3", 120-pound female who would, kick all the males' asses and, put them in their place. And that was in almost all these films had. And I just thought, like, there's no way in the world that that's reflective of reality. I mean, if a 5'3" woman was attacked by a 6'5" man, I mean, that would be a very one-sided fight. Yet it was something that was just constantly shown to me, time and time again. And I'm from Toronto. It's probably the most progressive, the most shitlib city in the entire world. But, you know, you go to it and, you know, the universities there are obviously the biggest concentration of that. I never once met somebody until the media started pushing it that identified as, you know, bi, gender, queer, non-binary, whatever it's called. And, you know, you go to one of those college bars, gender exists. I mean, guys are there trying to pick up girls, you know, they get mad at each other if, you know, they're interfering. I mean, it's just, it's so unreflective of reality. But I think it really just speaks to, though, the real influence that just constant messaging has upon people, and just how it has this way of warping just the truth that they see in front of them. And that's, I guess, why a lot of times people can't even bring themselves to admit something that they just know to be true, really.
Well, and that's why I think they have to bust up these communities, because if these same people that are coming out of the woodwork, or even like because let's face it, it's not the kids themselves, but these parents that are saying, "Oh, my kid is trans," you know, "my 3-year-old is trans," they are responding to the propaganda. They're being told that, like, "Oh, well, if your kid is trans, you got a special person on your hands there, and you can get all this attention for being special, and your kid it gets all this attention for being special, and it's total, like, you know, so if you ever see your little boy play with your lipstick or anything like that, then, you know, let's go get his genitals lopped off, and it's totally okay." And whereas that obviously would never, if these parents that are reacting to the normalization of this in media were to just talk about that to normal people, like, "Oh, you know, I saw little Billy playing with some lipstick. I think I'm going to have his dick cut off." It's like, you know, if they said that to a normal person, you'd be like, "Why?" But that's the thing, is everyone's so isolated now that their interactions are they don't have those communities, they don't have that support system, so all their interactions are with the people on their television screens. It's just with the propaganda, it's just with the talking heads on CNN telling them that all this is normal. It's just that, you know, the characters in video games, it's you know, there's not even, it's like with internet dating, for example, a lot of single guys, I remember when internet dating was like not cool, and you know, OkCupid was like this new thing, and it was kind of like nerdy if you used it, but now it's like, where else would you meet women? You know, like, literally, where else would you meet women? I mean, you can go to a bar, I guess, but I mean, if anyone who's met women at bars, you know that's not exactly relationship material 90% of the time. But
well, it used to be, yeah,
there's no,
it used to be church, but no one goes to church anymore. And it used to be university also, but now there are all these, you know, crazy blue-haired feminists.
Well, and what did they do with the university? They made it so that even trying to interact in any kind of sexual way with women on campus, it could be a very dangerous proposition, you know. So I don't even think that, and think of it this way too. Let's say you meet a woman at a university. You're meeting someone who isn't exactly prioritizing having a family. She's there to get her PhD or whatever, and to go make PowerPoint presentations in a cubicle somewhere for the rest of her life. So there's not a lot of places for men to meet women outside of this electronic world. So pretty much, or even like right now, the way we're interacting, obviously, is electronic. This is something that even 50 years ago, people would have these kind of political conversations, maybe in a beer hall somewhere, or you know, if it was a more organized thing, it could be somewhere in an auditorium somewhere. And what they've done is they've made that nearly impossible, where a lot of people are having to be anonymous to have unpopular opinions, and to protect their physical safety in many cases. So we've been forced, or whether it's, like I said, whether it's planned or not, it doesn't really matter. We're now in a situation where most of our interactions are electronic, and that's the easiest kind of interaction to subvert and to mutilate for these people, because you can just you know, just in the case of YouTube, you can artificially lower us down in the algorithm and artificially crank up you know, some kind of trans kid thing. And so if you're just some average person going to YouTube, all you're going to, and I'm sure you've seen since they've made a lot of the changes to the algorithm, you search for something that you used to be able to find right away. You look for even the identical title, and you don't find these videos anymore. You find some mainstream version of reality based on that title, and so that's I think ultimately what they want to do is just control every, they want to control the social feedback. They want to define what is normal, because they know that most humans want to conform to what they think is normal.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to something else that you really I talk about all the time on my channel, and that's like the real lie of the, like I mentioned at the beginning, the real lie of the free and open society. And I think that really goes deep, it cuts deeply to the very foundations of the West, maybe for even since the Enlightenment, which I often criticize on my channel. It's because we have this idea that we've been given this idea that liberalism and democracy and education, it makes us these that we're these rational individuals who just need to be educated, and then we'll come to a rational decision through the scientific method, and then we have our democracy to vote upon our leaders, and we will decide upon the best course of action, really. And the term, we've been talking about propaganda, but the term propaganda, one of the, I think, more brilliant things they've done is they've stigmatized the term propaganda. When people think propaganda today, they think either the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, or they think World War I propaganda posters or something like that. But they've kind of put it in our minds that we're above propaganda, and that liberalism is the rational option, and that it's something that we're not susceptible to these these messages that people in authoritarian regimes are. But that's really not the case when you look at the media and when you look at the education system. Would you say that there really is that it really kind of debunks the entire notion that really that we live in this kind of free and open society where the people really have this ability to direct the course in any way? Because I mean, look at what happened with Trump's election.
Yeah, no, I think that the system at this point, or at least the United States, is it's a dying system. I don't think it's going to survive. How it eventually collapses, I don't know. But I don't think the people's will is honored at all. I mean, it was almost impossible to get Trump elected, and whether or not that was even legitimate is questionable, to be honest. I mean, there's no way to really know. But none of the things that he ran on, none of the things that made Trump popular have been accomplished. And the will, and you can look, that's not just Trump. I mean, go back, and people have wanted immigration to be under control for forever, since like the 50s. And even when they were able to, the other side was able to push things like the Hart-Celler Act and all this stuff that has kind of screwed us over. It was done with lies. It was never done with informed consent. It was always like, oh, this will never, this isn't going to change the racial makeup of the country, or it's just going to be, it's just a few cases, we're always going to be the majority, that sort of a thing. So yeah, I don't think that the people have really had any say in where we're headed, at least not in this century. Maybe when it was a smaller, that's the problem too, is at least as the United States has gotten larger, the accountability for the ruling class has gone down, because there's so much just physical distance between, like how would I ever go and talk to Trump and tell him, the complaints I had about him? I couldn't. It's not even possible, and because it's so centralized for such a large group, spread out large group at this point, that no one's ever accountable for anything that they do. Hillary Clinton isn't accountable for breaking the law. Everyone knows that she broke the law. Any 12-year-old with internet access knows that she broke the law, but she's not accountable. And what could someone like me do? Nothing, really. And
or the Epstein one, like,
yeah, Epstein,
everyone knows that was a lie.
Everyone knows Epstein. Like whether he's still alive in Israel somewhere or whether he's dead or whatever, they know it's bullshit, and there's nothing they can do about it. and there's no accountability for anyone involved, and so that can't sustain. That can't go on indefinitely. That can go. In fact, I almost feel like it's like a game of Jenga where the ruling class knows how wobbly this tower of wooden blocks has become, and they just want to move as few pieces as possible at this point because they know at any moment it could just come crashing down. And so they don't want to arrest someone
And
like Hillary or something like that, because that could be the piece, that does it.
Yeah, and I know that Black Pilled is the name of the game, but maybe if there's any positives, do you think that they've kind of lost the script a bit? Because when you look at, I mean, like the movies that you analyze, they're really slick about them, and it takes a lot of skill to actually slip in a message like that. But I mean, these days, any 15-year-old guy who plays Call of Duty realizes that he's being propagandized. And or the another example is just how the narrative doesn't really seem to be all that popular. For example, when Trump came out and said they wanted to block off illegal immigration from Mexico, and that they were sending criminals and rapists and stuff like that. Of course, I know that he never actually followed through on that. But when he said that, the media acted as if he had, like I mentioned earlier, blasphemed the country's religion. And, it was almost as if, you could hear a pin drop in the room after someone said that because of how shocked everyone was. But then he won the election. So it really goes to show that whilst this narrative is in place and that the institutional strength is behind it, would you say that it's not really that there is actually backlash going against it, and that they've kind of lost the script when it comes to the narrative they're pushing?
Yes and no. I still think that this is a juggernaut that we're against. We're against. I mean, there's no benevolent billionaire funding any of us or any of our efforts, and there's several evil billionaires funding the other side. Even when we do get someone like Trump in office, nothing seems to change. The course never shifts. And in fact, if you go back, 50 years, whether it was Bush, because every Republican president has promised to get immigration under control, and even some Democrat presidents, Clinton was very, by today's standards, really tough on immigration, but it just nothing ever got done. There's never been the political will to do it, because again, there's no accountability. There's no ability for the average person to really affect change anymore because of the vast machine that's at work right now. I mean, we can be wrenches and throw ourselves into the gears and screw it up a little bit from time to time. But it's going to take a lot to actually make it come to a screeching halt. And you couple that with the fact that, I saw a statistic where it was something like 70% or somewhere around there, 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So you have a lot of these, wage slaves, because I don't know if it was 70% of the middle class or just in general. I don't know how they broke it up, but let's just say it's in general. 70% of the people, they need the machine to keep going just to stay alive. They don't have any savings. They don't have any kind of, they have no ability to provide for their family if the machine stops moving, even for a moment. Like if you're living paycheck to paycheck, that's pretty tight. So I think that without some kind of, again, religious, like the left has leveraged their ideas into a kind of a religious vehicle. I think without some kind of version of that on the right, without some kind of religious awakening or something that gives right-wing ideas kind of a divine mandate that makes people willing to sacrifice, a little more than what they might be willing to sacrifice otherwise. I don't think that really there's any stopping it. And, I could be wrong. I mean, we see these things going like in Virginia, where there's like militias and stuff like that getting called up because the left is overplaying their hand talking about gun confiscations, but I don't see that actually happening. I don't think that. I think that's more of just like a blip. Just in the same way that we had like 10 years ago. What were they called? The Minutemen on the border that were patrolling the Mexican border because the ICE wasn't doing it. So they were like, we're just going to get a bunch of guns and go to the border and stop it. Well, that was the news, and everyone was like psyched about it. And the next thing you know, like half of them get arrested, and the other half are feds, and and it goes away. So, and now no one even remembers that it happened. So it's such a big machine. It's hard to tangle with it unless. One thing that's good right now is at least it appears this way. I guess there's no way to know, but it looks as though there is a power struggle going on between the leftist elite and the right wing elites. I don't know how much of that's political theater and how much of that's really going on, but that's like I think if you want a white pill, it's that we might not have a whole lot of power to stop the machine. But if the machine's at war with itself, that's always a good thing. And that kind of seems to be what might be going on right now with all this impeachment stuff.
I mean, I guess my point is that I don't think that we're going to fix anything through democracy. I don't really believe in this system. I don't think it really exists in any real sense. But I just feel like it's becoming untenable. Like I can't. Just like when I think of the last, few years, the difference between now versus say 2012, it seems like really enormous, and that things have just accelerated so much since then. And I certainly don't. I do not subscribe to this idea that you need to like intentionally make things worse to make things better. But I definitely think that it does seem like they've lost a lot of the narrative, in my opinion, and that the problems really aren't going away. Like what Greg Johnson pointed out is that what's red pilling people is not necessarily you and I on YouTube speaking about these problems, or someone on Twitter, but it's just the reality of people's lives that people aren't living the same prosperous lives that the baby boomers would have, and there's not really any hope of that changing within the current paradigm. So would you say that just really the situation as it is just not really tenable for very long?
I would say, like, I forget who tweeted this out. I think it might have been today in response to Trump talking about how the stock market is, it's the best ever. They made the comment that, 30% of U.S. stocks are owned by foreign interests, and the out of the remaining stocks, like 85% of those are held by the top something like 10% of wealthy people in America. So when you talk about the stock market hitting these record highs, you're really not benefiting the average person. And I think that if you pay attention to the debt, which has just been skyrocketing for, I don't even know how long now. I don't even know what it is anymore. It's north of 20 trillion and maybe significantly so, because it's been a while since I looked at it. But we have all these unfunded liabilities. We have just insane amounts of debt. But at the same time, it's all funny money, so it's like, it's not as if the thing that people always, how come we don't have a gold backed dollar? We don't need to. We have a lead backed dollar. We've got a military backed dollar. Just ask Gaddafi how awesome gold backed currency is. Like the United States will put a stop to it. So I think that as long as the United States has military primacy, it's the economic situation, they can just shuffle the numbers around. It's none of it's real anyway. Like when they print more money, they can do so with impunity. It's not backed on anything. So for the situation to get so bad that people can't even get food anymore and that sort of thing, I think that, I don't know that we'll get to that level, because it's like this. I see it as, I feel like the elites are banking on, if we keep putting on this farce of an economic system, and we keep trying to develop AI and automation, all this stuff. Like, we'll hopefully by the time this system is, we can't sustain it anymore. The everyone sees the emperor has no clothes. It'll be okay because we'll have all this automation that at least make sure that everyone has enough to eat. Because that's usually people don't want to go to war for anything until like they can't provide for their family, And so as long as they can keep the calories flowing and the entertainment flowing, so as long as everyone has enough Cheetos and episodes of Breaking Bad or whatever their favorite show is, they're good. No one's gonna revolt. They'll just consume their Cheetos and their media, and they're not going to fight too hard against the system. So that's really my view of it right now.
Well, yeah, I think hopefully, I guess we could end on a positive note. There was one more thing I wanted to discuss, and what you had said earlier was that you think that the only really way out of that is if right-wing ideas take on some kind of religious drive, the same way that the left really has. And I actually am in full agreement with that. I find that is the reason that they have all the momentum behind them. And I think that what I wanted to talk about last is that we've been discussing propaganda and how it's being used to control and destroy Western civilization and people of European descent. But I'm of the opinion that propaganda is not actually a bad thing, because I think that every human society that's functional has some kind of system of control. I don't really believe in the free and open liberal democratic society where people are, control themselves as rational individuals. I don't think that's ever existed. And I think that you really do need some kind of power structure. And my objection to the one that exists today is that it's one that's designed to destroy us, really. But I think that if there was one that's really designed to facilitate a healthy and stable and fulfilling life for people, then it's a good thing. And I think that propaganda is something that can be used to uphold that. So what is your opinion on propaganda being used for a positive?
No, absolutely. Propaganda is just software. So that software can be a virus that's meant to take over your system and have it be controlled remotely by some guy in Nigeria, or it can be something that helps you become a more powerful and effective person. And so, in fact, I did a video called Logos Propaganda, and it was basically John Wayne, of all people, funded a series of, like, basically it's propaganda, just propaganda pieces. And one in particular was warning young boys about predatory men, sexually predatory men in Hollywood. And so, of course, it's been demonized, and in fact, it's probably considered hate speech at this point. But it was just a video saying, hey, look, if you're on your own walking around the streets and some older gentleman wants to buy you presents and be your friend, watch out. he might not be the long lost dad you never had. He might be up to no good. And so obviously that's an extreme example, but yeah, I mean, certainly I think propaganda, the word, has been demonized. Like you said, it's people now think it's synonymous with Stalin or Hitler or whatever, but there used to be in America, it was called the office of propaganda. And so it wasn't like a bad word until I guess the enemies of the United States were so successful using it that the United States decided in their propaganda they would demonize the word propaganda. And so that way you would differentiate their propaganda from the enemy's propaganda. So which was brilliant. I mean, it worked because, like you said, now people, oh no, that's just propaganda. What I like is truth. And it's like, well, like it's just it's objectively not true. Like everything, all this is propaganda. Whether it's coming from, I've made propaganda, positive propaganda, to use emotional manipulation, maybe to some extent, to more effectively transmit ideas. Not in a nefarious way, but certainly in an intentional way. And any speaker does that. If you're a passionate speaker You're basically trying to emotionally manipulate the crowd using different tone and different word selections. So I mean, anytime that you're trying to convey an idea to an audience in a way that's not just writing the idea down on a piece of paper and handing it to them, and even then, I guess you could say, if done correctly, it could be propaganda. It's propaganda. So there's nothing wrong at all with propaganda. Propaganda is a very positive thing, and we need more of it on our side. It's like I said, that's the problem. Isn't that there's propaganda? The problem is who's been in control of the propaganda for the last 100 years. If you were to change the heads, the studio heads, and all these people out with people who shared our values, and that's the only change you made. You didn't give them any directives or anything like that. You just changed out who they were to people who would have the same interests that you do and that your society does. Propaganda would be a very good thing in society. It's just currently it's run by the wrong people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the problem.
Yeah, I made a video about kind of my journey to, I guess you could say, far right or reactionary politics, or pro-European politics, whatever you want to call it. And I mentioned in that video that two of the most influential films, really, I'd say, ever on my development, weren't even really political films, but it was Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. And I made an entire video about why they're two of my favorite films of all time, and just the messages that it portrayed for me of masculinity, heroism, homeland, and just all the things that really resonated with me as a 17-year-old boy when I watched them. Gene Siskel and Robert Ebert saw the films, and they said that those films were propaganda. And I have to be honest, they probably were propaganda, but I think it's propaganda that really, for me, had a positive effect. And I think that it's definitely something that, sure, maybe I might have been propagandized, but it definitely led me, I think, in the right direction. Have you seen those films, Devon?
No, I'll definitely check them out though. Now I was just actually making a note of that. But no, every film is propaganda, even if it's not being explicitly political. I mean, there was, Brokeback Mountain was gay propaganda. You could say even Star Wars, certainly the new ones, but even the initial Star Wars had propaganda aspects to it. Where you have the multicultural planets versus the all white wearing bad guys, like that are clearly modeled after Nazi uniforms and that sort of a thing. So even if it's not even intentional, like let's just say the people designing the uniforms weren't thinking explicitly, let's make all these, the Empire wear uniforms designed by Hugo Boss. It's still even just like when I've done fiction, for example, I've made short films and that sort of a thing. And even if you're not intentionally trying to implant some kind of critique on society or hot take or whatever into your audience's minds, it seeps out. It's even if it's unintentional. So everything's propaganda. Everything has a message. It's just sometimes it's not that political, or it's not that earth shattering. It might just be something as simple as you should love your mom, or or something positive like that. But everything's propaganda.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that there's any diamonds in the rough that you found? So are there any films, TV series that you've come across maybe recently, or just as you pointed out, in the last 100 years, because a lot of it has been in control of a certain group of people. But have you come across anything that, you mentioned the John Wayne one, but is there anything else you can think of that really had positive messages, and that one that you really enjoyed?
Yeah, I would say, and because it's the Christmas time of year, It's a Wonderful Life, which it certainly has some subversive elements, but nothing's 100% pure, but I think it has a really good message. And I think it's one of my traditions. I watch it every year on Christmas, and it's a well-made film just from a filmmaking standpoint. I happen to like what's his face, Jimmy Stewart. I think he's one of my favorite actors, and so he does a good performance. I think that's a good one. It's also very anti-banker, very pro-family. I mean, there's just a lot of really good elements to it, and it was made during the golden era of, or at least, certainly the golden era of American aesthetics. So when you're watching it, it's just like it's this beautiful version of America that you're never going to see again, and it's a little sad at times, but like it's also very inspiring. For example, I'm sure you've seen it. Everyone's seen this movie at least once, but when they're just dancing, like when he meets the girl he ends up marrying, and they're just dancing at the high school gym, and the floor to the gym opens up, and there's like a swimming pool underneath it, and you think to yourself like, wow, this was like 1940, I don't know, like 3 or something, and you have this like beautifully constructed, fairly modern even by today's standards, school with all these kids that are homogeneous and seem to be a community. It's just like this, it's just a very, it kind of feels like we were talking, I think, before we went live about when you go to countries like say like the Ukraine or Poland or one of these Eastern countries that haven't embraced diversity yet, you kind of get like this weird feeling where of belonging, and I think that movie really has that. And lots of movies, that's one of the good things about 19 or movies made prior to like the 60s, is they weren't quite pushing multiculturalism yet. And but even like there's been movies, and maybe a more current one, and I have mixed feelings about this movie, which makes me feel like it is a good movie. There is definitely subversive stuff about it, but I also kind of like it, and that's The Breakfast Club, which is a 1980s movie about high school kids, and in fact, they address the boomer problem, which is kind of funny, and just kind of show the results of boomer. The way I view that movie, and maybe I'll do a video on it. It's just that there's just so much to unpack in it. But I think one of the things that I like the best about it is it really kind of shows you the results of boomer parenting. It's like you went, good contrast. You went from the kids in that high school I was just talking about, and It's a Wonderful Life, dressed like they're going to Sunday school, very respectfully and very homogeneous. They all have the same culture, and they all match, to just a couple decades later, the children of the boomers. You've got like the guy with the leather jacket and the metal spike sticking out of it, and his father's like this abusive alcoholic boomer. And then you've got like the jock kid, and he's got the leather jacket, and he's got like the the overachiever boomer dad, and then you've got the nerdy kid who doesn't have clothes that are cool, and has his dad's like a janitor or something like that, but he's trying to make it, he wants to be the first one to go to college and make a name for his family, and so it's kind of like a nice little slice of life. Even like I said, there is definitely some subversion in that movie. You can't make a teen movie without one, or without some. But yeah, I'd say that was good. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely good movie, and especially if you're just aware of it, there's nothing wrong. Like I think people a lot of people spurged out when I made my Joker review, and I think what they thought I was saying was that it wasn't a well-made film, or that you're not allowed to enjoy it, or something like that. And that's not what I'm saying at all with any of these movies. Honestly, you just have to be aware of who's making it, and what influences that they might, or how they might be trying to influence their audience with the movie itself. And as long as you're aware of that, like Breaking Bad isn't exactly super high-minded or pro-Western civilization in any way, shape, or form. And I really enjoyed that series. So as long as you're aware of it, there's nothing wrong with enjoying it to a certain extent. I'm sure there's a line you could cross, like if you're watching just something that's the whole thing is just satanic and and telling you to hate your race or whatever. I don't know. I'm sure there's movies that are just total cancer, but I think for the most part, as long as you're just aware of it, and more than anything, you shield children who don't have that discernment from this stuff. That's really what's more important.
Yeah, there was a film, and since it's the Christmas season, there's one I always make sure to see every Christmas, and that's Jouy Noel. It's a French film about the World War I 1914 Christmas truce. And I think the movie came out in 2004, and it could have been seen back then as like an anti-Iraq war. Maybe it would have been considered a liberal film back then. But when I look at the messages in it today, it's, well, anti-war has kind of been something that the far right has taken on, and also the idea of kind of no more brother wars and pan-Europeanism and kind of coming together uh, and putting our differences aside. That's really the main theme of the war, and sorry, that's the main theme of the film. And the film doesn't really have any of the the stuff, the subversion we get in historical films today. There isn't a bunch of there isn't people, minorities crammed in where they wouldn't have been historically. They actually have a religious celebration on Christmas. They celebrate Mass together. The Germans, French, and the Scottish all celebrate Mass together. And the film does actually, the German officer in the film is actually, they do point out that he's Jewish, but they didn't put anything in that I really find objectionable. There's even a line in the film where he says Christmas means nothing to him, but he'll always remember that night. So I'd say that if anyone's looking for something for the holiday season, some not propaganda movie, one that's both a great film and I think pushes a lot of good messages, that's one I'd recommend. Have you seen that one, Devon?
No, I'll definitely check that one. I'm adding that to my list.
Okay. Yeah.
I always like to hear about good new movies because, like, I've seen just an ungodly amount of movies, to be honest, and so it's rare that I hear of movies I haven't heard of before, and you're so far a great resource for that.
Yeah, a lot of European ones are a lot better than a lot of the American ones, in my opinion. But anyway, I think that that's actually a good place to call it. So big thanks for coming on, Devon. And I guess the last thing I want to say is Merry Christmas. And I think it's a real testament to our religion and to our holiday that, as you pointed out, so many non-Christians seem interested in writing music for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I just want to leave people on a good note, just because, like, I think a lot of people misunderstand when I say that, the system probably isn't salvageable and this, that, and the other. That doesn't mean you need to have that paralyze you in fear and in anxiety, and that you don't move on with your life and you don't, have children and that sort of a thing. Quite the opposite. It's just it's like with the movie thing. You're allowed to watch movies and just be mindful of the subversion. It's the same thing with my view of the future. It's, my outlook's not great, but it doesn't mean that I can't enjoy life and I can't, have a family and be productive. I just have to be aware of where we're headed. And so that's just something I wanted to say so that people don't think that I'm, all doom and gloom all the time. I'm actually a relatively positive person, believe it or not. So, so Merry Christmas, definitely. And thanks for having me on. And I got at least 3 new movies to check out. Nope. Are we still live? I think someone is muted.
Oh. Well, no.
Merry